Sally. Can everybody hear me okay? I hope so. Hi, my name's Dan McTeer. Thank you for coming, as the world's been on quite a roller coaster ride so far this year. Speaking of which, I was in a mountain biking wreck on Saturday and broke my elbow. So if you see me wincing on camera, it's because I'm in a little bit of pain still and trying to get through that. It's not because I'm not having a good time here. So let's let's get started on handling adoption and onboarding for Vault. Let me make sure I can click through this here. Here we go. There we go. Just to introduce myself, Ali spoke a little bit about this already. I previously worked at Adobe. I've been with HashiCorp for about 14 months now. Previous to that, I ran Vault for 2 years at Adobe, among other security services, but I've spent my career basically running shared services for large global companies. Everything from system and network administration to data center operations, those sorts of things. And then of course my educational background is all in information security. So I just want to give a little bit of context before we really get started into the adoption and onboarding piece of this. And I want to make clear too that this is very applicable to open source users just as much as it is enterprise users. These are processes you can frankly use for just about any shared service, honestly, but there will be some Vault specific things in here that we'll talk about. But one question I get asked very frequently as far as our running Vault as a shared service is why we picked Vault in the first place. And so I just want to give some context there. Adobe is basically a company built entirely off acquisitions. Even Photoshop is an acquisition from another company. And so we generally operated in multiple business units, and inside those business units, you had lots of different product offerings, and even within those products, you had lots of different teams supporting those, right? Like you had developers for Photoshop and for the mobile version, and the SRE teams that were, running their creative cloud presence, all those sorts of things. And so 3 major business units, 50 plus product teams, 50 plus products and 200 plus product teams. All from acquisitions. And so the problem we were facing was disconnect. Everybody was just doing everything in their own way. And this was everything from technical stacks to different tools to different methodologies. The difficulty lies in, particularly in security and compliance, where, they're used to managing things in a very standard way. But had to go out of their way to adapt to each of these different technical stacks, each of these different tools that forced them to kind of, leave the area of efficiency for them. So basically everybody was operating in silos, and there was a concerted effort going on behind the scenes to kind of consolidate tools and technical stacks and things like that to make things more efficient for everybody involved. And so as we started looking at secrets management tools, I specifically was part of the digital marketing business unit. Most people don't know that Adobe has a digital marketing business unit, but it's actually responsible for collecting more than 75% of the data across the globe, digital marketing data across the globe. So it's got a huge footprint, very large environment, very dynamic. We regularly had to ramp up and down for things like the Super Bowl or the World Cup or Apple developer conferences, things like that. And so we needed something that could handle very high workloads. And so we started looking into, the cost of adopting different tools. And this wasn't just about, to us, support costs or infrastructure costs. It was about costs of getting our users to adapt to those new tools as we changed between them. And so things like support and training, where every time we pull in a new tool, we have to do some training with our users on how to use that tool. Workflows adjusted as people had to develop different functions to adapt to those different tools. And then of course, scalability When you're looking at scalability, you're not just looking at, can I grow this infrastructure? Can this service handle more transactions per second? You're also looking at, those other teams that are involved in that, back to security and compliance, for instance, where, they may have to know how to read 20 different log formats or things like that. But then you're also looking at how people implement use cases, right? And in some tools, they may be able to do it a certain way, but they have to do it a completely different way in another tool to make it work, which was frequently the case. We had one managed services team who was building a new platform that would help customers self-service onto their platform. Adobe tools are digital marketing tools are notoriously difficult to implement. They're the world's best for sure, but they're difficult to implement. And so a lot of the times our bigger customers would pay us to run those data collection mechanisms on behalf of them, and then they would come in and view the data. And so this team was building out a new platform that would allow these customers to self-service, and they were doing that inside of Azure. And based on their particular use case and what they wanted to do with those customer secrets, it would have about $3.6 million per month to implement their secrets management according to their use case. And we were able to basically provision them a Vault cluster for a much cheaper price than that. We had another team, another part of this managed services team, who ran an autonomous environment inside AWS, tens of thousands of hosts. And the reason it was disconnected was because customers were accessing this, and then internal Adobe employees were accessing this. So we had to have it separated for obvious reasons. As we onboarded this team to Vault, we found out pretty quickly what they were doing was they were basically, as they were provisioning these hosts, they were provisioning hundreds of user accounts with unique credentials on each of these hosts. And so over the course of a couple of weeks, they ended up creating over 3 million secrets. As we took a look at that and came up with a better way for them to implement that use case, it took us about 9 months to get them on the right track. What that would have ended up costing us throughout that 9 months was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2.5 million per month just to store those secrets in AWS. So somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million over the course of that 9 months to get that single mistake cleaned up, right? You face a lot of real-time costs with a lot of the tool options there. And so, looking at those hidden costs again, this is kind of based on our experience with Vault. This is kind of what we looked at. Regardless of what tool you adopt, this is about what you're looking at on average per employee. And so essentially our goal was to make sure that, the next time we had to adopt a secrets management tool and get people onboarded to that, we wanted to focus on just doing it one more time, right? And consolidating on a single thing in order to avoid these ongoing costs. And so if you look at the cost based on those numbers of adopting a single tool and then adopting a second tool and a third tool, those costs really start to stack up. And again, this is not support costs or infrastructure costs. These are all those additional costs as far as training and onboarding go, security evaluation go. And so a lot of times we see, people adopt a tool because they have a specific use case they want to solve, or they adopt a different tool because it's simpler to use what's in the cloud where their infrastructure is running, things like that. But there really is an enormous cost as those things start to stack up. So again, our goal is really to, find that single control plane that we can basically consolidate on. We have some consistency there. People are able to use the same API no matter where they're getting secrets from. The API has really flexible functionality, so they can build just about any sort of automation they want with whatever tools they want to use. Scalability was huge. Right about this same time is when we became full multi-cloud, when we started adopting Azure. And so Adobe infrastructure, for the most part, runs in data center, AWS, and Azure. And so we had a huge presence across different clouds in different regions of the globe. One particular occurrence that really spoke to the choice that we made and how good of a choice it was that we made was when we went to deploy in China. We had a number of customers that wanted to collect digital marketing data in China for a number of different reasons. As we started to deploy our other supporting tools out there, what we started to notice was that the APIs, at least for Amazon and Azure, were multiple versions behind what they were in the rest of the world. But because we had Vault and because we could deploy that same binary that we had in all these other places, again, our users got a consistent experience even in China where that was very difficult to accommodate. So I want to give some more context here. Again, bear with me. I want to emphasize the importance of a good support team. A lot of times I see companies hand this service to a security team. Security is an excellent partner in this journey. They're a necessary part of this. This is obviously a security tool, and so security plays a critical role in that. But the issues that you run into as a support team are mostly system administration related or related to giving users guidance on how to integrate with their operational processes or their apps or things like that. So I want to emphasize how important it is to run it as a shared service. I saw far too many times SRE teams attached to specific products who were responsible for, knowing just about everything there was under the sun, which made it difficult for them to support those products. It's really nice to have this consolidated into a single group of experts. By the time that I left Adobe, we had 6 people specifically supporting Vault. And that made it easy for people to find a central point where they could call in essentially and get the sort of help that they needed. You didn't have to wonder, which SRE on which team knew the most about which feature or anything like that. There was just a single team that was a point of contact. It improved efficiency and productivity in the sense that SREs were freed from having to, again, be a mile wide and an inch deep. It freed up time for them to focus on other important things, specifically relating to customer experience. The coolest part about it was the community that was kind of naturally built around it. We use Slack as our primary support platform. We had a channel in there that just anybody using Vault could go into and ask for help, request help for their problems. It started out mostly as my team answering a lot of those questions, but towards the end of my time at Adobe, it almost kind of became the Stack Overflow of Adobe, right? You could go into that channel, you could search through old questions and a lot of times find the answers that you need. But at that point in time, we had so many people using Vault, consolidated on Vault, that most of our community members were answering questions for us. There was very little that people on my team had to do to support the solution. So this is kind of the breakdown. Phase 1 was our first year of deployment. About 6 months of that was actual, building of processes and deploying the infrastructure and the service and all that kind of stuff. And then the other 6 months of that was starting, some of the onboarding for some of the digital marketing people. So I handled that with 2 employees. Half of my team was here in the US and half was in Romania. And so we were able to have a nice follow the sun on call rotation. So 1 employee here, 1 in Europe, and then we had a contractor that helped with the onboarding as well. And we were able to take care of most of the people in the digital marketing business unit just with that on staff. And that second year is when I started adding more people. That's when we started expanding out to the rest of the use cases in digital marketing and all the creative cloud folks. And that's where the support burden kind of exploded, I guess. There were a lot of people wanting to onboard all at one time, and so we really needed to help accommodate that. My recommendation is, about 15 to 20, one full-time employee for every about 15 to 20 teams that you have to support. I get asked a lot, what the ratio is per application. The thing is most of the time teams are the structure, and some of those teams may support one application, they may support 20 applications. Generally speaking, you only have to train a team one time. It doesn't matter how many applications they run, and then that team knows what to do with all of those applications. You generally don't have to train them on how to integrate with each application. So that's kind of my thinking behind that recommendation. Just real quick, I hired one senior SRE on the team. This was somebody, a little bit heavier in system administration experience, but, also had a good understanding of automation tools, of CI/CD, of some development practices, things like that. And then I hired one of these senior DevOps engineers. This was somebody who historically had really been a developer, but had, some good experience in system administration. And then I filled out the rest of my team with what I refer to as DevOps engineers. These people were a good mix of both of those practices. And so here's kind of the breakdown of their roles and responsibilities. The DevOps engineers would be kind of the tier 1 support. They'd take the brunt of the support calls. They'd handle the onboarding, the monitoring of the service, all that sort of thing. The 2 senior level people were there mostly for mentorship, to design, to architect, to take on the more complicated support calls, and build out the processes that support the service, things like that. So our focus was really these 3 principles. A lot of times you're going to run into people who don't really understand DevOps, much less Vault. And so it's important to be patient with them as they kind of figure those principles out and how to apply them in their own environment. The second principle there being empathy. It's always important to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, see their perspective, and then last but not least, attentiveness. Make sure you understand their use cases. It's difficult to solve a problem if you don't know what problem you're trying to solve. Okay, so into adoption. How do you get people to adopt this? Most have seen this innovation adoption lifecycle, and kind of have an understanding of how and why people adopt something and when they do it. I just wanted to point out real quick some of the common issues that we ran into as we started to deploy the service and get people to adopt it. A lot of the times, lack of urgency was a big one. If you don't have upper management support, it can be difficult to get people below that to jump on board. A lot of the times, politics was definitely a big one. At the time that I joined, one of my first tasks was to find a secrets management tool, and we already had CyberArk and Thycotic implemented in other places in the organization. Having to dig through that or navigate that relationship with the teams that ran those solutions was sometimes a difficult thing. And so just kind of paint some extra light around this. I want to talk about some really terrible ideas that have happened throughout the years. The first one is light bulbs. Back in the late 1800s, Thomas Edison was working on the first iteration of the incandescent light bulb. And as they caught word of this over in the UK, the gas companies, in partnership with the British Parliament, formed a very impartial committee to evaluate the usefulness of light bulbs in the UK. They ended that investigation deciding that light bulbs weren't right yet. And they said, and I quote, "It was good enough for our transatlantic friends, but unworthy of the attention of practical or scientific men." Fortunately, the people in the UK began adopting electric lighting just a year later, and then within 3 years of that, you started seeing electric lighting out in public places, out in streets, parks, things like that, which was great. We all know the value of electric light bulbs at this point. So one of the things we had to do, we were in a business unit that did not report up to the CSO, did not report necessarily up to any branch of the corporate business unit other than the CEO. And so we had a lot of autonomy, a lot of freedom to make our own decisions based on what was right for our users. And our philosophy was that if our users want to use it, then we won't have a difficult time getting them to adopt it. I do see a lot of times security teams who come along and decide something is the best security tool based off a list of check marks that have been given to them, via security practices or the business or something like that. A lot of the times that's great to check security checkboxes, but if your users don't want to use what you have to offer, it will never be successful. And so one thing we noticed was that people wanted to use Vault, right? They, as soon as they caught wind that we were standing up Vault in production, we had a number of teams come to us and say, hey, when is this going to be ready? When can we be onboarded, all that sort of thing. And so we knew Vault was the right decision for us. And so in our case, in spite of being asked why we can't just use what's already there, we just went ahead and deployed Vault for the digital marketing business unit. And started onboarding people to that. The conversation went from, why don't you use what we already have, to, hey, what you're doing looks really cool. Can you tell us more about it? To, hey, why don't we just adopt this across all of Adobe? And it was eventually the CSO who made that decision. Funny enough, the teams who supported CyberArk and Thycotic rolled up underneath him, but even he understood the value of the tool and that it was more important to accommodate users' needs if we can than it was to necessarily pick what everybody says is the top tool on the list. So kind of three keys to adoption. Adoption is really a game of influence. Yes, people are going to come to you and say, hey, we heard you're running Vault, can we use it? But for the most part, you need to take it a step further than that. It is a little bit of evangelization, a little bit of internal sales, so to speak. So you start with flexible standards. And what I mean by that is you standardize on Vault, standardize on an API. Vault can exist everywhere, basically. It can be used by every platform, every provider, all that sorts of thing. So you make that the standard. You have a set of security policies that define the end goal, but you don't tell people how they have to get to that goal. As long as their method is secure, it shouldn't really matter, as long as they're meeting that objective. And so generally speaking, when we would talk to people, the promise that they could get rid of 3 functions for 1, or the promise that this one more change for secrets management should be enough, and you shouldn't have to deal with this again. That sort of thing was enough to get people to shift. Again, that whole China experience that happened a year after we went production was a huge testament to us being on the right track and having made the right decision. Second key to driving adoption is trust. And this is the biggest reason why I brought up the support team factor. Nothing goes farther in building trust with your users than to have a group of people supporting your service that have been in their shoes. So because I had system operators, SREs, developers on my team, they could give sound advice to our users, advice that made sense, that worked in their use case, all that sort of thing. They were able to give that support to them, and that went a long way in building that trust relationship. People will not use your service if they don't trust you. So make sure you have the right team supporting, and make sure you're giving the right type of guidance to your users. And then finally, I can't say enough good things about the community aspect. And I want to talk about a couple things real quick about, I would say about a year into our production Vault deployment, we partnered with HashiCorp, and we got a hold of, they basically the slide deck that they presented at HashiConf for Vault 101. We took that, we put our own little, Adobe specific information in that. And then we set up some registration pages on our intranet site, and started letting people register for in-person classes. And every 6 months, we would go to all of our major sites and we would teach in-person classes. Those training classes were always full, 30 to 40 people. The night before we'd show up, we would basically use a Terraform template to spin up a lab environment in AWS. We'd give those people credentials, and then we'd show up the next day, do a whole hands-on training for 8 hours, and each person had their own Vault environment. And generally speaking, by the end of that class, people would understand how they needed to plug their application or their service into Vault, and some basic, Vault commands and things like that that could help them out throughout that. There were a lot of really cool benefits that came from this. The first one is that it gave my team the opportunity to kind of step away from their desk and do something other than just typing all day long or managing systems all day long or writing processes all day long. It gave them a chance to get out and present in front of people and to share their ideas and things like that. The second big piece of that was that our users were able to put a face to the name. Going back to the key, the second key for adoption as far as trust goes, when you meet the people you're supporting in person, it takes that relationship to just a whole different level. They know who they're dealing with. They know, at least somewhat what kind of person you are, your technical background, things like that. They've gotten some advice from you. It just takes things to a whole different level and goes towards building that trust in you and your service. One of the best things, though, that came from that was most of the time, within just a couple of hours of that training finishing, we would see those same users that we trained earlier that day out in our Slack channel supporting other users, other new users. And so over time, it really gave a boost to our support, really cut down our support overhead in that respect. The cool thing is we would record those sessions, and you could do the same, and really you can chop those things up. You can put them on an internal learning management system, and then they're there for people to kind of consume at their own pace, in their own time. Again, we only ran these training classes every 6 months, and so it wasn't always easy to get in, but there was this other option there, especially for new employees who maybe got hired the week after, and needed to go through that training, couldn't wait 6 months. The other cool thing about that 6-month cadence is as new features would come out for Vault, our training would be updated and we would present on those new features. So it constantly gave us the opportunity to update that training and provide that to our internal users a couple times throughout the year. So outside of that, we had a program that we referred to as Tech Talks. The cool thing about this program was it gave our users the opportunity to go and speak in front of other users. Generally speaking, this was about once a month and about an hour long. It was usually a presentation accompanied with a demo, and we had pretty good turnouts for the most part. 100, 150 people each time we held one of these. The great thing here is these are generally the I hate to call it thought leaders or influencers, but these were the people who everybody knew, everybody looked up to, everybody respected, the senior SREs, the principal SREs, getting up and talking about, what security challenges they were having and how Vault helped them fix that, and then showing a demo and giving those ideas to their peers. Nothing is more powerful than having somebody talk to their peer about your tool and what sort of benefits it would bring them. We actually gave them $50 Amazon gift cards every time people would present as a way to kind of entice people into giving those presentations. So I encourage you to find those influencers inside of your organization. They are your biggest allies. They are your biggest drivers for adoption. Get those people to present, to talk to other people. There are other things you can do outside of that. You can encourage smaller rewards for things like internal blog posts or knowledge base articles. Those things work pretty well. If you're looking for ways to scale this out in a larger organization, we started what we referred to as the champion program, where we would select certain people from different teams to be the local Vault expert, so to speak, and those people would help support things on their local team essentially. But get some sandbox environments up and running. If you're still in the phases, pre-production, it's good to build some sandbox or some POC environments that internal employees can use and just mess around with. So I want to talk about another really bad idea called umbrellas. This gentleman here with the blue umbrella, his name is Jonas Hanway. He was an Englishman born in the early 1700s. And then about the mid 1700s, he ended up taking a trip to France. And when he returned, he had this sweet new device with him known as an umbrella. Up until this point, umbrellas were really only used by women or Far East royalty as a way to, shade themselves from the sun. It was really the parasol, which was invented over 4,000 years ago. And then there was a Frenchman who came along. His name was Jean Marius. He decided to kind of iterate on that a little bit. And so he made a folding version and made it weatherproof. And pretty soon everybody in France was using umbrellas for all different sorts of reasons. And so when Jonas arrived, pretty much everybody, including men, were using umbrellas. And so he decided he was going to purchase one and take it back with him. These were not common in Britain at the time, even for women in a lot of cases. And so as he walked down the street, people were literally and figuratively throwing trash at him for his choice to use an umbrella. By the time he died, it started to really catch on. And as we all know, nowadays, this is a very common thing for people to use for lots of different reasons. So there's a couple key points from this story. Again, never underestimate the influence that certain people can have in your organization in driving adoption of your service. Again, those thought leaders, those influencers, those senior SREs, those senior developers, get them out there talking to other users. Not only will it help make things more efficient and secure in the long run, but it will help people understand the value of the service in general and get them to onboard to the service. And then, of course, the second part is that sharing experiences can boost innovation. Having those people talk in front of their peers is not just about influencing them. It's about getting them to come up with better ways of securing their infrastructure or their applications. So lots of good benefits there from being out in front and helping to drive the direction of security. So just a couple of key points. Again, leaders drive change. This isn't always about title. In some cases it is. Again, it took us deploying Vault regardless of what we were what people were suggesting, and it took the CSO to finally step in and say, this is the direction we're going, before all of the company could finally standardize on Vault. But again, those thought leaders, those influencers can really help drive a lot of that aside from the title part. The thing is if you don't have the leaders in title helping to push adoption of the service, a lot of times what you end up with is people who just won't align with that adoption. They won't embrace that change, and so they even kind of feel emboldened to ignore it. So make sure that there's some good alignment between you, the service owner, the influencers, and the leadership in the company to make sure you drive in this direction. And then second part is simple and successful. We've seen kind of a staggering shift from typing in passwords to using things like fingerprints or facial recognition or things like that. Anybody who's set up fingerprints or facial recognition on an iPhone knows how absolutely simple that is versus having to type in a code or a password or something like that. Again, a lot of the times people showed up to us to ask us to use Vault because not only were we meeting security demands in the way that they preferred to meet them, but they knew they would be able to build some automation that would simplify their lives as a result of their choice to adopt. And so again, give people simplicity. Vault is certainly has some complexities as far as deployment goes and configuration goes. But what people really truly understand is the value once they've adopted that, once they get to know how to use that, they truly understand the value of the level of security they can be given and the amount of time they can save by integrating automation into their secrets management. Okay, so onboarding. I'm just going to talk about the process a little bit here. Definitely, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we can get those addressed as soon as we're done with the presentation here. So it's important to start with tools, the right tools to help your users, right? You never want a user calling you up and asking for documentation on how to use your service, for instance. When they're ready to start using the service, this stuff should be done by the time they're starting to call and ask for those things. And so these were kind of our three main pieces of support tools that we would offer our users. Documentation was the first one. We have a lot of really great documentation on learn.hashicorp.com, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people don't necessarily have a week to spend, digging through a lot of those scenarios and doing the hands-on things and all those sorts of things. And so we found a quick start document very useful in those kinds of situations. This was something you could read in 15 minutes, 20 minutes, that would give you a good idea of, how to authenticate with Vault, how to use a token, how to write a secret, how to read a secret, all those sorts of things. Just a really quick crash course. Scripts, for the most part, there were only two that we really had, and these were scripts really to just help people migrate from Thycotic or CyberArk. So nothing fancy there. There are some good HashiCorp talks you can find on different support tools that are good to build for your users, easy to do, and quick to throw together in Python, things like that, that might be helpful to your users or might not. Just do a couple Google searches for those. And then finally, examples. It was common for us to, for instance, provide a Python code snippet or a Java code snippet of, here's how you make a call to the Vault API, here's how you authenticate, here's how you get a token, here's how you use that token to do something. And so we did have code samples posted internally for our users to take a look at to help them get started on their integration with Vault. And so those three things together usually would cover most people's questions about how to get started. So here's a Vault deployment plan I kind of threw together, and I'm not going to be talking about this plan too much. If you have questions specifically, about this later on, let's talk about it. But what I wanted to call out mostly right here is that you'll notice that the creation of our support tools comes about 2/3 of the way through the deployment. It was common for us to, even though we had a plan and started executing on that plan, it was common for us to find, problems here and there with what we thought would work versus what actually did. And I imagine this is common for most people. And so the reason we waited so long into the deployment cycle to build our support tools and our support documentation was to make sure that whatever we were documenting was the real true state of things. We were far enough along that we knew for sure, this is how this would work and this is how this would work. And so that's why we chose to do it kind of further along, closer to the actual production deployment. So step one of onboarding, at least for us, and I do recommend this. Again, there's going to be some specific things about Vault in here, but this is good practice for any shared service that you provide. So step one for us was sending an initial communication. This was basically just an email that gave them a brief overview of what Vault was and how it worked. We would attach documentation links or other support links in that email that they could look at just kind of on their own time. One other thing that I didn't add here that could potentially be optional if you want it to be. It was common for us to provide them with what we referred to as our SLR template, or service level requirements template. This was basically a questionnaire that we would send to our users to get, hopefully get information before the onboarding meeting on, what their expectations were for service availability, what sorts of use cases they had, all those sorts of things. But again, that's optional. You don't necessarily have to do that. So. And then step two, user training. Your first couple user trainings may not be ready yet. I highly recommend getting them ready before production deployment, but if you can't manage to do that, again, learn.hashicorp is a good place to send those people for some more in-depth, hands-on type training on Vault. So again, we would post those registration forms online just a couple months ahead, and then we would start sending out reminder emails, sometimes just a couple weeks apart up until that time. And then we would create a lab environment the night before, and then we would record those training sessions, but we'd get those users some good hands-on training with interacting with Vault. And that usually came right before we were ready to kind of deploy our stage environment, our POC type environment for people to start messing around with. And then after that, we would have our initial onboarding meeting. The slide I showed earlier about the team that accidentally dumped millions of secrets into Vault, that would have cost us millions of dollars otherwise. They were almost single-handedly responsible for this decision. And what we decided to do was, if you were a first-time Vault user, then we required you to meet with us just anywhere from about 20 to 30 minutes. We wanted to sit down with you, discuss your use cases, your requirements, some of your ideas around implementation. But that was a really great catch-all for people who didn't show up to training or didn't take the time to read documentation or things like that. That was a good catch-all for us to be able to say, no, that's a terrible idea, or yeah, please, go ahead and do that. That sounds great. The eventual goal here would be self-service, but again, keep in mind, many of your users likely don't understand how to integrate with these tools or how to interact with the tools once they're integrated. And so this is a really good opportunity to quickly train them on those things. Step 4 is provisioning their environment. Really, this is just about creating their namespace if they're an enterprise user, or creating a mount for them in the root namespace if you're an open source user. What I really want to call out here is that our process, at least on my team for onboarding, was we started with a Git repository. We had an enterprise license for Git. We had an internal hosted Git service. And we would basically create a repository for each team and put their initial security policy in that. And then from that point forward, anybody on my team or anybody on their team were allowed to make changes to that in the form of a pull request. And what would happen is once that pull request was submitted, it would go through a number of syntax checks and security checks and things like that. And then it would eventually show up as a peer review. Somebody on my team would do a final peer review, and then once that change was merged in, once it had finished all the checks, that would become the state of things in production or whatever other environment they wanted to use. The reason I bring this up is, for some people, this will be natural. This will feel natural. This whole concept of configuration as code. For other people, this is not a natural thing. And many wondered why we were doing things this way. Again, this is a really great opportunity for people who aren't familiar with DevOps practices or good automation practices. This is a good opportunity for them to get their feet wet on a very, very simple process to help them kind of start on that path and kind of spark those ideas of how they should be doing things in other places in their environment. So once you have that provision, obviously send all the necessary information out to them and get them started. This is arguably the most important step of them all. And this is some that a lot of internal service providers sometimes forget. It's easy though to set a simple reminder or dedicate a couple of hours of one day to following up with teams or things like that. But what you want to do is any new team that's been onboarded, you want to reach out to them once a week for a few weeks following their onboarding. A lot of times people onboard to a service, they'll start taking a look at things, they'll get overwhelmed or confused, and then they'll just stop. it's important to make sure they're successful because their success drives your success as the service provider. So make sure you're reaching out to them and talking about the lessons they've learned as they've adopted Vault, any problems they're running into. Make sure you get feedback from them on how you can improve the service or features that they'd love to have but just aren't there that you can talk with HashiCorp about, things like that. So these were the onboarding phases that we followed, and this was, really kind of true to form and along the adoption lifecycle. But phase one was generally the innovators in that adoption lifecycle. These were the people who always wanted bleeding edge. Again, these were the people who were knocking on our door even before we had a POC environment available, asking when they could start using Vault. And so usually what I say is, again, it takes about 6 months. If a single person's doing it, it takes about 6 months to build out all the mechanisms and infrastructure and everything you need to deploy a Vault. You can start theoretically, depending on where you're at in that deployment phase, you can start onboarding some of these innovators within the first 3 to 6 months of that deployment process. So just keep that in mind. Again, it's a very small percentage. In our case, it was about 5 or 6 teams that we allowed to start essentially beta testing our service before we rolled it to production. And most of these people, it's easy to identify them. Again, they're going to knock on your door. They're going to be persistent, and they're going to give you the best feedback you've ever had, frankly. So definitely let them on early before production happens so you can get the wrinkles ironed out. Here's kind of where that falls in that deployment plan. Again, that's that initial POC environment, stage environment, dev environment, whatever you want to call it in your particular situation. Get those people on board. Phase two is generally these types of people. These are also people who are knocking on your door, but they don't necessarily want to use a service that isn't in production yet for any reason. They want to know that you've iron things out, that things are super stable, super reliable, things like that. So they want to use the service, but they want to wait until you have something production ready. In our case, this was probably about another 100 teams. This happens from about month 6 to about month 18, where these people, again, they were showing up on our door. We did not have to keep any sort of list of who was on board and who wasn't. It was just simply, show up and we'll let you on board. And so pretty easy to identify these people. And again, this filled our support time up to 1.5 years into essentially running the service. So that's kind of where this falls in. This is that initial Vault deployment. Again, this is something that's ongoing. Onboarding obviously is an ongoing thing, and so I don't want people to think like this ends at some point, obviously. So, but this is where we started onboarding that group. So this final group, phase 3, a lot of times laggards won't ever adopt. In fact, they're often referred to as the group that adopts something by the time it's no longer useful. And so you don't need to worry too much about them. What you need to worry about is that late majority. And generally speaking, that's where you're going to start keeping a list of all the people who haven't adopted yet. And this starts about 1.5 years in. You're going to put that list together of people who haven't adopted yet, and then you're going to start reaching out to them one by one. And usually you'll be able to tell pretty quickly whether they fall into late majority or whether they fall into laggard. For the most part, this late majority sees the value in Vault, value in automation. They just don't necessarily see like urgency, for instance. And so, just start kind of weeding through that list of people, reaching out to them, getting them to onboard, doing some hand holding best you can, things like that. So kind of wrapping up here, just a quick recap. Again, support team, absolutely critical. Choose the right people for the job. This will go a long way in building trust. This will go a long way in keeping the service healthy and reliable. This will go a long way in making sure your users are supported in the proper way. Community, again, I can't overstate how critical community is to adoption and onboarding, not just for helping drive people to the service, but helping support them after the fact. Having that community built is absolutely critical in every way. And then having some structure. I know this sounds strange after we talk about agility and flexible standards and things like that, but what I mean by this is make some decisions early on, for instance, about what you will and will not support. We did have one team come to us who wanted us to install an external Vault plugin that accommodated his CI/CD tool of choice. As far as I knew, he was the only person in the entire company, or his team was the only people in the entire company using this particular CI/CD tool. The thing is we had a lot of automated processes to evaluate new builds of Vault, to evaluate new features that we turned on, to do benchmarking, all sorts of things. What we didn't want to get into was this game of, adding one variable for one particular customer that may just throw all that stuff into total chaos. And so make a decision early on. In our case, it was a decision we were just going to support the core functionality of Vault that made it so simple for us to keep that testing consistent and keep that validation, those validation pipelines consistent. Going forward into the maturity of the service. So make sure you have processes in place, onboarding process, for instance, from Git to automated validation to peer review to reality. This was the case for a lot of stuff we did. So make sure you have those processes in place, make sure you're following those. It does help to cut down on support overhead. Manual at first. Eventually you can move to self-service. They're still not quite at the point where they feel comfortable with self-service yet at Adobe for a couple different reasons. But again, there are many automated processes, but they are, over 3 years into their Vault journey at this point and still won't quite trust full self-service yet. But that's going to be different for every organization. And so, just kind of keep a pulse on that. Cool. So that's it. Just kind of wrapping up. Let's go to questions.
Perfect. So we have a question here. Do you want me to just read them off, Dan, or do you want to?
Let me see if I can click that open. Sorry, I have to reach across myself to.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay. So the question is, can you throw a little more light on the workflow process that was implemented for Vault configuration as code? Is it JSON? Is it HCL? So there were a lot of different things. It was mostly HCL. There were a couple places we used JSON. It was more about what we were trying to do with a specific aspect of it. I would say for the most part, we had a standard process, and we used Jenkins as our CI/CD tool. We did have a standard process in deploying the service and managing those configuration files going forward. We were a heavy Terraform user. We use SaltStack for configuration management and things like high states to keep things in a certain configuration. But for the most part, all of our configuration, again, was managed in Git. Any changes went in the form of a pull request. Again, were processed through syntax checks, security checks, things like that, went to a peer review. Once that peer review was approved, we had multiple environments. So it would hit a dev environment first. Our dev environment, I think most people would probably call it a stage environment. That was kind of an opt-in environment for our internal users to test their code. And so any changes we made that were approved through that workflow went to that environment first and kind of baked there for 2 to 4 weeks. And then were rolled out to production after that via that same workflow. So hopefully that answers that question. What is sourced from VCS and baked into Terraform using the Vault provider? Looking for a little more insight to that. I'm not sure I understand that question. So I might need some clarification on that question. I apologize. let me move on to the second question real quick while we're waiting for that. How much freedom and autonomy do you recommend giving each team? What are some examples of standards that are required for teams to follow? So my answer to that would be this is again where the value of the onboarding meeting is. You can get a pretty good pulse from somebody in 15 or 20 minutes on whether or not they know what they're doing. And so it's almost like hate to call it like an FBI interview or something, right? Like you're really just trying to figure out what the person really truly knows about DevOps practices, about configuration and infrastructure as code, things like that, whether they truly understand the logic of, tokens with TTLs and things like that. And so you can get a pretty good idea from that initial onboarding meeting, whether they can be given more freedom or not. So I would say that that's kind of how you gauge that sort of thing. As far as examples of standards that teams are required to follow, for the most part, things like setting a maximum TTL for tokens, for instance, was a big one. For one reason or another, the original engineer that I had deploy Vault it made the decision to set our default token TTL to 180 days. Most organizations have a 90-day limit on credentials before they need to be rotated or refreshed. But for some reason, he chose 180, unbeknownst to me. That ended up causing problems when we had people come in and for instance, run a Jenkins pipeline that ran every 5 minutes and pulled a credential that it would only use once, right? We did have a cluster where that was happening, and before we knew it, we had hundreds of thousands of tokens that were sitting on there that had only ever been used once, but were alive for 180 days essentially. And so, making sure you have that default TTL set is a good one to have in place via policy, and then on top of that, making sure that's part of your user training, instructing people, if you're going to build a Jenkins process that runs every 5 minutes that only needs to use a token once, then set the token TTL to 5 minutes as well. That'll go a long way in reducing the support workload. So, okay, cool. It looks like that's it. Does anybody else have any other questions? Oh, sorry, I gotta scroll down here. How many namespaces were you handling? So our method was to assign a namespace per team, because again, based on our structure, a team might be running one application, they might be running 20 applications. I don't know if that's entirely true for every organization. I do suspect it is the truth for a lot of them, but we would provision a namespace per team essentially. There are customers who have chosen to provision a namespace per application, which I actually feel like is a better idea, with a caveat, however, and I'll talk about that caveat in a second. But from an operational perspective and a security perspective both, when you have applications limited to a single namespace per application, that limits the impact that any security event or operational event will have on that application. So for instance, if you're just rotating secrets and fat finger something, for instance, you're only breaking one application if you have a namespace per application. If you have a security event where your secrets somehow get compromised, you only have to rotate secrets for one application. If you're doing it by team, sometimes that might be one, sometimes that might be 20, right? So, so some things to think about there. The caveat is console as a storage backend is limited at 5,000, a combination of 5,000 namespaces / mounts, right? So you could have 5,000 namespaces, you could have 5,000 mounts, you could have 2,500 of each. It doesn't really matter. Once you hit that, you start to see significant performance degradation. And so you just have to be careful about how you provision that out, how you plan that out. Make sure that if you have more than 5,000 applications, it's probably not a good idea to have a namespace per application. Otherwise, you're getting to the point where you need to start running multiple clusters. So. Cool. Any other questions? Let's see. Do you have recommendations on how to handle secrets shared by multiple teams? I mean, there's no great way to do this, but if it's the sort of thing where both teams need to have access constantly, then you really just have to come up with ways to give both groups access to that, but always stick with that principle of least privilege, right? Like if one group should be writing and reading, but another one only needs to read, then make sure you're setting your policies as such. Outside of that, if it's the kind of thing where your group has a secret that maybe you need to, loan somebody from another team every few months or something like that, there's some good options in there as far as secrets wrapping and cubbyhole that could be utilized for things like that, kind of like a zero bin type situation. So make sure you're leveraging that rather than giving some sort of permanent access to a secrets amount. Next question is, given a large number of teams and associated namespaces, how did Adobe track license usage? So the licensing model has obviously changed significantly. We purchased Vault back in late 2016, and it was a very different licensing model than it is right now. But for the most part, because we have everything mapped to teams and because we have well-documented mapping to who the technical contacts are and which applications they're running on those namespaces and all those sorts of things, it will be easy for Adobe to transition to the new model of a client per application or a client per user. Aside from that, there are scripts available, for instance, to count entities or certain things like that, but it will be easy for us to transition to that. If you're having difficulty counting that for your own organization, if you're more mature and have been on a different licensing model, definitely reach out to us. We can help you with that. But there are some great new features, telemetry features coming in 1.6 that will solve a lot of those problems for you. So. Cool, great questions. Anybody else have any questions? Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody. Ali, I think we're going to have a recording of this available later on sometime. Cool.
Yep, absolutely. So everyone will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with today's recording and then my information as well. So if you want to follow up with Dan, you can just reach out to me and let me know and I'll connect you to. And I think that's it for today.
Awesome. Thanks everybody for joining. It was a pleasure to be here.